Go forth, mind, body, and spirit. We are at the whitehouse.gov. Executive orders. Delivering gold standard childhood vaccine recommendations for Americans. Executive orders. August 10th, 2026, year of our Lord. Executive Order 14420. By the authority vested in me as President of the United States Constitution and laws of the United States of America, I is hereby ordered. Section 1, Purpose and Policy. Pursuant to the Presidential Memorandum of December 5th, 2025, aligning the United States core childhood vaccine recommendations with best practices from peer-developed countries, the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, completed a scientific assessment which identified a set of consensus vaccines that are consistently recommended in all peer countries and found that the United States currently recommends more childhood vaccines than any peer nation, including more than twice as many vaccines doses as some European nations' scientific assessment. The scientific assessment also found that instead of implementing vaccination mandates, most peer nations maintain high childhood vaccination rates through public trust and education. In the United States, by contrast, individual states set mandatory vaccination requirements that children must meet to attend school. Executive Order 14407 of May 29, 2026, realigning United States core childhood vaccination recommendations with best practices from peer-developed countries, committed. The federal government was ensuring that all Americans are receiving the best scientifically supported medical advice in the world, as well as protecting religious liberty and parental authority. However, implementation of my administration's prior directive regarding childhood vaccines had been delayed due to litigation over the composition of the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices separate to the updates of the federal vaccine schedule. Therefore, I am taking further action to reaffirm that the policy of the United States that the core childhood vaccine recommendations should be aligned with scientific evidence and best practices from peer-developed countries while preserving access to vaccines currently available for Americans. Furthermore, it is the policy of my administration that federal programs and funding should support maximum parental choice over childhood vaccines, consistent with the federal government's constitutional and statutory obligations and the fundamental principles of personal autonomy and informed consent. Section 2. Recommendations for childhood and adolescent vaccines. A. Based on the consultation with my advisors and review of available scientific evidence, it is hereby declared that the United States recognizes the gold standard childhood vaccine recommendations, informed by the three distinct categories of childhood immunization recommendations identified in the specific scientific assessment as specified as follows. 1. Immunization recommendations for all children: measles, mumps, rubella, diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, and polio, Haemophilus, influenza type B, pneumococcal disease, human papillomavirus, and varicella. 2. Immunizations recommended for certain high-risk groups or populations: respiratory syncytial virus, monoclonal antibodies, hepatitis A, hepatitis B, meningococcal B, meningococcal ACWY, and dengue. And 3. Immunizations based off shared clinical decision making: hepatitis A, hepatitis B, rotavirus, meningococcal disease, influenza, and COVID-19. B. The gold standard childhood vaccine recommendations also recognize the combined measles, mumps, rubella, the MMR, vaccine should be administered in 3 separate single disease shots. 1 such products are domestically available, and that, to the maximum extent feasible, all childhood immunizations should be administered at separate medical visits. Each C. Each executive department and agency shall review the gold standard childhood vaccine recommendations and take appropriate steps to advance them to the fullest extent allowable by law. D. States and territories are advised to review the gold standard childhood vaccine recommendations and to consider updating relevant laws and regulations that define the scope of immunization requirement for contexts such as school enrollment and attendance based on the scientific assessment and best practices from peer-developed countries. E. The United States will routinely reassess the gold standard childhood vaccine recommendations according to the findings of the HHS Task Force on Safer Childhood Vaccines as specified in Section 3 of this order, which lead us to Section 3 of this order. Improving vaccine research and options for American parents. The Secretary of the HHS, through the HHS Task Force on Safer Childhood Vaccines, shall, within 90 days of this day of this order, present plans to the President through the Assistant to the President for Domestic Policy to the extent that the appropriate and consistent with applicable law. A. Offer options to administer the core childhood vaccine starting with MMR as a single vaccines rather than combination product doses, including by law, by working with the private sector and other countries as appropriate, while guaranteeing continued availability of combined vaccines and those vaccines recommended for those shared clinical decision-making. B. Assess the ideal timing and sequencing of all core childhood vaccines and adjust the federal childhood and adolescent vaccine schedule shall appropriate based on gold standard science. C. Develop additional alternatives adjuvants to aluminum and conduct comparatively the safety and efficacy studies. D. Ensure continuous evaluation of the risk-benefit profiles of all childhood vaccines based off the United States and international data. And E. Improve vaccine safety monitoring, transparency, and research. Section 4. Maximizing parental choice over childhood vaccines. A. The Attorney General shall take appropriate measures to further meritoriously legal action challenging state laws that conflict with the state's constitutional and federal statutory obligations related to the parental authority, religious freedom, disability accommodation, and equal protection under the law, including, to the extent applicable under federal law, states' obligation to provide religious and medical exemptions from childhood adolescent immunization requirements. B. The Department of Justice, Education, and HHS shall take appropriate action to ensure that their contractors and grantees, including states and localities, are compliant with their constitutional and federal statutory obligations related to parental authority, religious freedom, disability accommodations, and equal protection under the law, including, to the extent applicable under federal law, their obligations to provide religious and medical exemptions from their childhood adolescent immunization requirements. Section 5. General provisions, wrapping it up in A. Nothing in this order shall be construed to impair or otherwise affect. I. The authority granted by law an executive department of agency or the head thereof. Or 2. The functions of the Director of the Offices of Management and Budget relating to the budgetary, administrative, or legal proposals. And B. This order shall be implemented consistent with applicable law and subject to the availability of appropriations. And C. This order is not intended to and does not create any right or benefit, substantive or procedural, enforceable at law or in equity by any part against the United States, its departments, agencies, or entities, its officers, employees, or agents, or any other person. D. The cost for the publication of this order shall be borne by the Department of Health and Human Services. Donald J. Trump, the White House, August 10th, 2026, year of our Lord. And you've got your documentation you can actually download for reference. Go forth, mind, body, and spirit.